This is the 17th episode of the Psych Survivalist, Anger, the Coin of the Realm, Part 1. For those who have visited my podcast, The Psych Survivalist, before and are listening to this new episode, I would like to welcome you back. I stopped producing episodes for this podcast for a number of reasons, most important of which was that I was not sure how my comments were being received. I have since begun using AI, the Microsoft version, Copilot, because in a weird way it holds up a mirror, not only to what I am doing, but to how audience think of psychology at all and how they are receiving my comments. It seems to me the only way I could get out of the bubble that I was broadcasting from. This is a low-budget enterprise, but I also know that there are very few people, if any, who have the kind of experience I do and are practicing in the field of psychology. It seems to be generally accepted that one of the main goals of psychology is to see why people don't get along and have difficulty with their individual life situations. Most podcasts like this are self-help in nature, whereas this is more experiential, based on a wealth of experience by this practitioner and understanding that friction between oneself and one's environment does not always require readjustment by the person seeking help. One of my biggest objections against my chosen field is that it is so focused on the individual that practitioners display very little awareness of the context in which not only the client, but the psychologist, him or herself, functions in the world, and are part of a culture that create these kinds of adversarial relationships. I have always approached individual problems with a broad lens, and especially when doing psychological assessments or reviewing previously written psychological evaluations. I have always considered them in the context of where the subject is functioning, who the subject is, and the point of view of the person doing the evaluation and writing the report. I may not be the only one, but certainly one of the few who takes a broad view of what creates problems for any individual or any group. So, if Freud or Jung develop a theory about the unconscious, these theories are based on an individual's personal experience, and the therapy is on the same level. At least that is the way that most practitioners apply these theories. Unlike these iconic theorists, I am always looking at the broader picture, almost like looking at a being of great magnitude but small stature, swimming around in a medium in a petri dish. This is not to say that the individuals involved are so small, but that within context, the world is extremely large, filled with contradictions of great variety that are often confounding for us, and I include myself, to functioning. More than that, while we are confounded, we are pressured to make decisions in our lives that make our decision-making process even more difficult, if only because we are relatively small to stand up to them. It is within this context that I have taken to calling this new episode Anger, the Coin of the Realm. The reason for this title should be obvious to anyone living in this period of time. We see anger everywhere. The resolution for most disagreements is anger and often violence. So I asked Copilot to create an episode about anger. Just as I expected, it presented me with a variety of analyses which I requested, but none of which express my point of view. Copilot does not speak for me, nor will it ever, but what it does tell me is how most people in my profession think about the issues that we are currently living through. I have no problem holding an opinion that is divergent from Copilot because I have lived a much fuller life than this machine, and the information it provides me is from the literature as it draws from almost everywhere on the internet. That's all well and good for a machine, but it's not the way that humans live, and if I had lived that way, I never would have survived. And believe me, there was plenty to threaten me over the years. So I asked Copilot to put on a few different hats associated with psychology in order to interpret the nature of anger, so I would have something to reflect upon and more accurately discuss while addressing my audience here. The first thing that it stated, taking a forensic psychological point of view, was the following, and I quote, "A forensic psychologist treats anger not as an emotion, but as behavioral data, a currency people use to negotiate power, control, and threat. Anger is transactional. It has motive, method, and measurable impact." Close quote. Now, in order to understand my point of view, I will first say that I worked for years as a forensic psychologist, and as a result, I know how to interpret this machine's interpretation of the situation of anger from a forensic psychology viewpoint. A single comment by Copilot that follows illustrates my point as it describes antecedents. What conditions reliably precede the anger? Here, in the very beginning, we diverge, and what follows is my understanding of why this is wrong. Indeed, why most psychologists who think this way may additionally be wrong. To introduce the topic, I will present some situations that raise the question: what is an antecedent exactly, and how does it resolve in anger? The first thing to notice is that each of these situations is extremely different and appears in very different contexts, so that the idea that there is a common way of understanding these events really misses the point of each of them. I would hope that the listener is able to follow along and see how each of these has applied in their world and their experience, although I will provide my own explanation for each of these events. The first only happened about a week ago on Substack, where I saw a woman who posted a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with a comment on AI. As I explained to her in my response, "I agree with you, but I still use AI. Ask me why." She proceeded to unload on me with a barrage of all the reasons AI is harmful to humanity. I could feel her rage in her comment. But the one sign of respect she did not offer is to ask me why I believed what I did about AI. She was on the verge of calling me names, and when she saw my simple reply, which was that it was an industry that needed to be regulated, further, I expressed my opinion that AOC would likely agree with me. I would add parenthetically that I do not see AI or Copilot as a panacea, but as a tool of investigation and sometimes creation. In fact, I see it as a toy. But while I agreed with her that AI needed to be reined in so that it does not destroy people or destroy the environment, it was not enough to establish common ground with someone who is already enraged. I should further add that I am retired. Now, this was not a therapy session. We had no other contact than on social media, and I had no obligation to work things out with her, nor did I expect that we would come to any agreement. But what did follow was that she called me some pretty foul names, even though she didn't know me, and did not get my complete opinion about this new phenomenon that appears to be taking over the world. I'll add one further thing. In case the listener hasn't picked up on it, I am not an enthusiastic supporter of AI, but it is a valuable tool and toy that should not be abused. But there are no regulations to prevent its abuse, and I'll repeat what I said earlier so as not to lose the point that I am trying to make now. What you are hearing is entirely my opinion, and frankly, what Copilot has said about the issue of anger is stuff that you can find in many popular psychology books. But it doesn't help us recognize or address the world that we live in and what life looks like for the overwhelming majority of us. So what is the important point in this particular case? At least the way things look now, this is a political issue that requires political action. The industry that creates AI is not going to monitor itself or its effect on people or on the environment. That is the purpose of regulation. But if you have been living long enough during this period of time, you should be well aware that regulation in certain quarters is considered a dirty word. I happen to be of the opinion that my interlocutor was someone who was under threat from her living situation, including from the development of AI data centers that may be taking her water, her electricity, and other resources, thus driving up the price to her, causing her to suddenly find herself living in a hostile physical environment in the service not only of AI, but also of money. This, to me, is the context in which she was attacking me. But further, she probably was also under the contradictory belief that regulation is bad, especially the conservative elements in our political system, which would much prefer that there be little or no regulation at all. And so, unless I am interpreting incorrectly, she is straddling two worlds. One in which she does not want herself or perhaps other people to be subjected to what may be a poisonous environment, but she doesn't want the industries that are poisoning where she lives to be regulated, except according to what she finds acceptable. This is hardly unusual for people, and I would assume that the listener knows of people very much like this. But one additional point applies here, that if you don't listen and aren't willing to look at alternative points of view, you might miss the underlying problem that you are confronted with. This is a very therapeutic issue and is felt in many other ways, although in very different contexts, in a therapy session. But we are looking for antecedents, and I will present you with two other examples, one from my own life. I have said before, although I have been disagreed with, that my history, traumatic as it was for a lot of it, was really not that bad. What people miss who want to interpret my life for me, people who are friends but are not open-minded enough to even accept how difficult someone's upbringing, my upbringing, might have been, is that even traumatic experiences, however bad, can teach us a lot. As I once said, as I review all of the things that I went through as a child into being an adult, I find it both informative but also a source of play to a large extent. This conforms to my overall belief, by the way, that nothing we experience is ever forgotten, but that the therapy for any of this is that we put it in a context that allows us to understand how those experiences created us, because that is not only who we were, but in my opinion, who we are and are going to be. Whether we think we have forgotten stuff, I would argue that nothing is forgotten, even and perhaps especially the stuff that we want to forget. For those mystics out there, and I know there are a few, you can see these erasable memories as being part of what has been called the Akashic Record. If we don't recall these events, they still influence us despite all of our efforts to escape. But the situation in my life that I am describing was the recent memory that, when I was about 3 years old, my brother, who was 4 years older for reasons of development, much larger and stronger, and for no other particular reason, tried to smother me under a pillow on 2 different occasions. I could describe numerous occasions on which he tried to break me both physically and psychologically. He used to love to confuse me and put me in situations that I had no experience with and that were threatening. The funny thing is, and perhaps this is the reason I'm doubted when I say that none of this upsets me, when I had enough distance to be able to understand what happened and put it in context, I realized that it presented to me a wealth of information about who I am and how I deal with adversity. It also taught me about him and people like him who try to harm other people almost as a knee-jerk, but to gratify their basest instinct. I know very well that there are many people who first recognize me as the same innocent that was the object of abuse by an older brother. What they tend not to see while they focus on my apparent weakness is how quickly I am to understand and interpret the kind of stress that they would subject me to. What they also don't seem to recognize or appreciate is that I really don't care about the pride they take manipulating people, and further, I really don't care about what they perceive as a lack of pride in me, something that I learned from my circumstances at a very early age. It seems impossible to imagine for these people that this is actually a survival skill, the lack of pride that is necessary to cope in an angry environment with predators on all sides. In other words, the less you show, the less they know. Lastly, in this discussion, I want to talk about Adolf Hitler. I am a Jew, and Hitler was a monster, but as I have been reading, he did not spring up from nowhere. I have recently read about the Treaty of Versailles that followed the First World War, the Great War as it was called because there wasn't a Second World War at the time, in which, as described by John Keynes, a British economist, entitled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, that treaty as enacted by Germany's neighbors, all of which demanded retribution, some demanding in excess of the amount of suffering they were subjected to. The end result was that the litigants, those countries that in one way or another had to defend themselves, were demanding amounts that were in such great excess that Germany's economy was entirely crippled. To me, and perhaps to you, the listener, this was fertile ground for an authoritarian to take over and once again inflict Germany's military might on the world. Psychologically, this is the way retribution works. It might scare some into submission at first, but after a period of time, those who do not cower in fear are likely to rise up and fight back. But as the Treaty of Versailles would inform us, overstepping your bounds has consequences too. I say this because we see it enacted in Ukraine, Iran, and in the United States itself. There's almost so much abuse that you can take before your only choice is to do something about it for no other reason than to reinforce an acceptable order. In each of these cases, the antecedents are not intrapersonal, but are nevertheless psychological and have broad impact on individuals, although many of them, especially those who prefer not to get involved and are otherwise not paying attention, may suffer psychological stress that may even exceed what they would suffer if they were aware and participated in the events around them. Unlike co-pilot, these are also antecedents of anger that are not only reactions to events that occur in a broader context, but to have other and significant psychological effects. Once again, I would like to invite your comments in whatever way suits you to contact me. There is nothing that I will discuss here that is unique to either of us, the listener or the podcaster, that we cannot discuss on equal footing. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware. The most important instruction occurs in our daily lives.